delighted we've been able to have so many fruitful events on U.S.-India cooperation. And again, a special thanks to our two universities and the U.S. Department of State for supporting us along the way. Over the past 2 years, we looked at U.S.-India collaboration across a spectrum of issues: military, defense, digital economy, cybersecurity, non-traditional maritime security, social media, political values. We've already brought out 5 publications with more in the works. Our target audience in this project is Indian millennials and the Gen Z. India has the largest global generational cohort of millennials, so they should be able to have a big impact going forward. Today and tomorrow, just to give a background of the events and the topics that we're interested in, is our 5th event. And we're going to take a closer look at 2 areas that we believe are critically important in the Indo-Pacific. One, security, that is defense strategy, military, economic security, etc. And the second on global commons, ocean health, blue economy, climate change, maritime law, etc. So today we start with security and we take up the commons tomorrow, as Professor mentioned. The primary question we ask is whether these areas, security and the global commons, can serve as the building blocks for even greater U.S.-India collaboration in the Indo-Pacific, and specifically, whether cooperation on these issues can serve as the basis for more regional institution building. In the security arena, we've seen a great deal of new agreements, projects, informal groupings in recent years, from signing BECA to the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, that is Quad, and we wonder whether these can be or should be translated into more lasting institutional structures, and whether it is better for the US and India to lead or assist in these efforts. We're not assuming that formal or informal approaches are better. We want to explore this and hear what our esteemed speakers think about it and why. A secondary question we also want to probe is the question of which analytical framework in international relations people see as most useful for themselves when they're trying to understand or explain US-India collaboration, and how far the countries can go in leading or helping to build regional institutions. Do they find realism, liberalism, or norms-based approaches most helpful? Of course, this is the question that students and scholars spend a lot of time thinking about. Perhaps some policy experts do as well. Well, with that said, it is now my great pleasure to introduce my dean, the dean of the Elliott School at GW, Alyssa Ayers, who will inaugurate the conference. Dean Ayers is herself a specialist of U.S.-India relations and a consummate scholar practitioner. Among her many accomplishments, she's the author of the award-winning book, Our Time Has Come, How India is Making Its Place in the World. She's also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia during the Obama administration. Dean Ayers will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move to our 3 distinguished panelists, whom I will introduce at that point. So, Alyssa, over to you. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Deepa. And of course, I am very happy to help inaugurate this gathering, and it's wonderful to see so many friends here today. As Deepa just mentioned, this is the 5th and the final event of a project that our own Rising Powers Initiative, led by Professor Olapalli, in collaboration with Christ University's Department of International Studies, Political Science and History, have collaborated on over the past 2 years. So I just want to underscore our thanks to Christ University, to Professor Manoharan, and to Pro Vice Chancellor Father Joe CC for your support and collaboration over these past 2 years. And I also want to echo Deepa's thanks to the U.S. Department of State for their support of this project. I really like the idea of trying to take a look at what millennials may be thinking about the trajectory for cooperation, the possibilities and prospects in the Indo-Pacific. At GW, at George Washington University, and at the Elliott School too, we are looking for further ways we can strengthen our own educational cooperation with Indian institutions. And the university itself, GW, has just been awarded a Fulbright Nehru grant to host Indian university administrators on our campus in the months ahead. Now, on today's topic, I was very, very happy to join the first of these last year in April 2021. So a little bit less than a year and a half ago, when our two schools discussed India and the United States in a more multipolar world. Of course, today the focus is on regional architecture for partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. This is a question in which I actually have more than a passing interest, so I wanted to offer just a couple words to suggest ways of exploring it. I promise I won't go beyond my 5 minutes, and I know you will all go into this far more deeply over the course of the next 2 days. But I would just note that right before the pandemic shut down global travel, I was in India in December 2019 to address the Delhi Dialogue gathering on precisely this question. That year, the Delhi Dialogue focused on partnership in the Indo-Pacific, and it took place back to back, so in a tandem convening on the heels of the Indian Ocean Dialogue. So I wanted to share a few thoughts from that earlier presentation, as I think they remain relevant today. To me, one of the central challenges here is how to arrive at an agreed upon scope of priorities for security engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Because the term itself connotes a vision of maritime security, particularly freedom of navigation principles, images of naval cooperation, that's very high profile illustrations. And those are all military forms of cooperation. We've seen a shared emphasis among many Indo-Pacific nations on the importance of preserving a rules-based international order, and in the maritime context, specifically on freedom of navigation and protecting the sea lanes. In fact, that's a core pillar of the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This is a vital agenda. But I also think there are important civilian security concerns that a robust agenda for an Indian Ocean concept should incorporate, including on broad security coordination, economic growth and prosperity, and environmental priorities. So to me, this isn't a binary of security versus the commons, but rather a way of thinking about the military and civilian security elements that we should pursue together. This would include civilian priorities such as cooperation on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism through conversations about terrorism designations, sanctions, counter-terrorist financing. The entire subject of homeland security engages law enforcement in megacities or air and land and sea ports of entry. That actually suggests the need for deepened collaboration and mechanisms that would engage national, state level, and city level law enforcement. So across national and subnational levels, that's a kind of international engagement that is expanding rapidly around the world. I would also suggest the importance of a priority, especially in this region in the Indo-Pacific, of human security concerns like the welfare of refugees and trafficking in persons. The Indo-Pacific region has some very high-profile needs, such as the case of the Rohingya refugees. And of course, we all know about challenges of human trafficking across the larger region. On the economic side, too, with the rapid expansion of China's Belt and Road Initiative since 2013, attention to infrastructure finance and sovereignty in economic statecraft has today become a strategic dimension through concern about excessive debt or debt traps. So that's something else to also keep on the agenda. And of course, as Professor Olapalli mentioned at the top, the Indo-Pacific region faces enormous security risks from climate change, and that is going to require an intensified level of international coordination, such as on the nuts and bolts of resilience in coastal areas as well as inland. And that actually means that best practices sharing on disaster risk reduction and disaster response can be a key element of Indo-Pacific security cooperation. So then the question becomes how regional architectures can advance these priorities. And the challenge then becomes a question of how do you create a deepened coordination across an array of institutions that include only parts of the large Indo-Pacific region in their geographies. The most institutionalized organizations were developed across the Asia-Pacific, deeply embedded in East and Southeast Asia, without a view to expanding or including the Indian Ocean. Take the East Asia Summit or ASEAN or APEC on the economic side as examples there. You can find through lines of consultation on some of these many issues across different architectures, but not region-wide. APEC, for example, has prioritized enhancing trade in environmental goods. EAS has had a long-standing emphasis on climate change for at least the past decade. ASEAN has had a working group on climate since 2009. The Indian Ocean Rim Association has a blue economy and sustainability priority that encompasses its work, but it doesn't get you everything across the entire region. On the human security side, I would also note the importance of the Colombo process, which covers most of South Asia and some of the labor-sending Southeast Asian countries. It's an important consultation for work on human security issues of trafficking in persons and coordinates closely with the UN. There's also been a lot of attention given to the growth and strengthening of the Quad, the quadrilateral consultation. In fact, the strengthening of trilateral and quadrilateral consultations gives great flexibility to bring like-minded countries together on all or any or some of these cross-cutting issues. And it also supports better coordination in countries' participation in the larger and more institutionalized architectures as well. So to me, this all suggests that development of a fully region-wide architecture for the Indo-Pacific will likely require some kind of flexible coordination among existing organizations in the absence of a formal agreement to advance goals in parallel. And I think that presents ample scope for India and the United States to devise, as they have been doing, new mechanisms to advance cooperation across these issues, as well as across the existing architectures. So I know the next panel will have many more suggestions and some thinking across all of these issues, and you will discuss this in depth over the course of the conference. So I look forward to that and to the further conversations that will result. So with that, let me turn things back to Professor Olapalli to get our panel started, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for setting the stage for the conference so brilliantly. I think what you suggested about the fact that it is not a trade-off between security versus commons is noted. And so I know you may not be able to join us tomorrow, but that's exactly what we're going to be doing on the commons tomorrow. So now I have the great privilege of turning to our main panel for the day, which will indeed look more closely at the regional architecture for security and what their thoughts on this. We have three very well-known speakers to this panel, and I'm delighted to introduce them now. Jeff Smith joins us from the Heritage Foundation. He's the senior fellow there. He's a leading defense and security expert on South Asia. His book, Cold Peace, China-India Rivalry in the 21st Century, is one that I often turn to and assign to my classes. So Jeff will speak about how he sees cooperation on defense and strategic issues developing, whether it's naval, military, defense, intelligence, and so on, and what it means for his views on institution building. He will be followed by Lisa Curtis, who is the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security, CNAS. She has extensive experience in national security, having served in the U.S. government in various high-level positions, including as the Senior Director for South and Central Asia, the National Security Council under President Trump. She has a special focus on India-U.S. strategic relations and cooperation under the Quad, so she will talk about how she sees cooperation on political, economic, security issues developing, especially through the Quad. A lot of questions about the Quad, I'm sure. Last, but certainly not least, is Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of Naval Staff of the Indian Navy. He is one of India's most decorated naval officers and really a key visionary behind India's maritime strategy, in fact, for India's naval takeoff, I would say. He's been a member of India's National Security Advisory Board and was chairman of the National Maritime Foundation. I should add that I follow him on Twitter, where I always get some interesting and unexpected information. Sir, it's my honor to have you, and welcome. Jeff will lead us off, followed by Lisa. Each of them will speak for about 12 minutes, and then Admiral Prakash will offer his commentary for about 7. And I will then have a short discussion with them and open it up for Q&A. So, Jeff, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for hosting this conference. Great to see everyone. It's great to hear the overview from Alyssa. I think somebody might need to be. Okay. All right. With that set up, I was asked to come and speak a bit about strategic and defense ties, I think particularly between India and the United States, but also what this might mean or what we might do together in terms of building a regional security architecture. And, in some ways, the strategic and defense portfolio, at least for U.S.-India relations, has been the easier portfolio. And that's not to suggest it's always been easy, because it certainly has not. But compared to economic cooperation, compared to some of the other portfolios, I think this has seen the most progress since really the India and the United States opened a new chapter in their relationship in 2005 with the civil nuclear deal and the 10-year defense partnership. And since then, we really have seen a steady stream of progress on the defense front in the bilateral relationship. And the pace of that progress, I would argue, really has accelerated over the past 5 to 10 years. And there are a number of reasons for that. But I think the progress has been so great that in some ways we have become victims of our own success. And that is to say that many of the items that were on the long-standing wish list for promoters of U.S.-India defense cooperation, many of the items that we wrangled over and argued over and deliberated for years and years and wondered if they would ever come to fruition, have been accomplished in the last few years. All of the foundational military agreements, many of the pending arms sales agreements, intelligence sharing arrangements, military exercises, the Quad, these other minilateral dialogues. For many years, these were distant prospects, and I would argue a very short period of time, historically speaking, they have come to fruition. And so this strategic defense angle has been a strength in the bilateral relationship. And just yesterday, we got a new piece of information that Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall announced that as of August 15th, the Indian military attaché at the Pentagon would now have unescorted access throughout the Pentagon. Yet another sign that the two sides are deepening practical cooperation and realizing this vision for major defense partner. So let me just speak a little bit more about the India-US defense relationship, and then we can zoom out to the regional. I do think, despite all the progress, there is more that the two sides can do and should be focusing their attention on in the years ahead. And some of that is relatively mundane and relates to breaking down some of the bureaucratic obstacles and red tape that continue to exist in both capitals. Investment caps, ownership limits, and offset policies in India. In the US, I think the Congress could move to amend the Arms Export Control Act that would essentially ease congressional notification requirements for arms sales to India. I think there's a lot that we can look at in terms of new exercises, military exercises, both in a bilateral but also a multilateral context. I was personally very encouraged to see the resumption of the Malabar quadrilateral naval exercises, coinciding with the revival of the Quad. I think there may even be opportunity to bring in observers to those exercises and broaden the scope of this military cooperation. I think there's frankly a lot being done in the cyber arena with India that I think could also be broadened out at a regional level. That's not my personal area of expertise, but heritage cyber experts recently co-authored a paper with cyber experts at VIF in India, and I thought they had some really productive recommendations on how to enhance cooperation there. We have this Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, DTTI, that was established in 2012 and really has struggled to produce a tangible win, an actual project where we can collaborate on from the ground up, even trying to start small. We have struggled for a variety of reasons to produce a win. That initiative has been restructured now multiple times, most recently under the Biden administration. And we're taking another stab at developing an unmanned aerial vehicle prototype. I think It really is important for the leadership in both countries to send signals down the bureaucracy that this is a priority, and we need to show something from this. Clearly, the will is there to enhance cooperation in defense production, but we haven't yet matched that ambition with tangible progress. And so I would love to see the two sides get a win there. Um, I've written about it and spoke about it at length. I think we need to come up with a long-term resolution to the CAATSA question in India-US ties. I don't think it's healthy to have that sword sort of dangling over the bilateral relationship. I think there's fundamental problems with CAATSA, and I think rather than putting out fires every few months, we need to come up with a long-term resolution to that. I've got a lot more on the bilateral relationship on the Quad. I'm not going to take up any of Lisa's mojo on the Quad, but I think that does and will have a big role to play in the regional security question. And I think in many ways, the India-US relationship and even India itself is at the center of what's driving the Quad. And the Quad really can only move as quickly as India wants it to. And so India plays a big part in the future trajectory of the Quad and how that continues to develop. I still think there's a lot we can do, more we can do on counterterrorism questions, on the future of Afghanistan, even on the South China Sea, where India has spoken up vocally about the importance of the rules-based order there and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I think we can be more vocal on our concerns about what's happening in the Taiwan Strait. There's a lot left to do on the bilateral end. On the multilateral side, the regional security architecture is, as was sort of laid out in the introduction, is underdeveloped, to say the least, particularly in the South Asia, Indian Ocean half of the Indo-Pacific. And it strikes me that this is more the norm than the aberration. I mean, if we look back through certainly contemporary history, but farther, there's not great precedent for a regional security architecture. Part of the complication there is the enduring rivalry between the region's two most significant powers, India and Pakistan, and that has, in many ways, prevented even much smaller initiatives from bearing fruit and making progress. I mean, we've even struggled to see something like SARC realize its potential, in part because of that enduring rivalry. And I do fear that so long as that continues, there will be difficulty finding consensus among the key players in the region on these sort of security architecture questions. And so what we have in the absence of that is a move toward minilateralism, toward bilateral security arrangements, and increasingly multilateral security arrangements. The Quad is the most prominent among those, but we also have some very significant trilateral strategic dialogues, ongoing trilateral cooperative mechanisms. We have a new Quad, what some people are calling the West Asian Quad. Others are calling it the I2U2. That's not focused specifically on the Indian Ocean. It also includes the Middle East, Israel, United Arab Emirates, United States, and India. And that is more focused on the global commons, healthcare, digital than it is on security. But will it have a role in shaping the discussion and the norms for the region? Yes, I think it will. I think we're going to have this overlapping series of bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral arrangements that together constitute an informal security architecture and network, but one that certainly lacks the distinct form of the European Union, and I think is likely to fall short of even what we've been able to accomplish in East Asia, where ASEAN has sort of served as the convener and the overseer of a loose regional architecture there. Some of what they've created in East Asia does have some overlap for the Indo-Pacific and for South Asia. But I think this is going to continue to be a region driven first and foremost by sovereign countries and by the relationships they form and the multilateral coalitions that they form. And so that's the general overview, but I'm very interested in digging in deeper during the moderated discussion and during Q&A. So thank you again for having me on.
Thank you, Jeff, for laying out the challenges and maybe some prospects for regional institution building in the security side. I just want to say, Admiral Prakash, I just want to mention that I would like you to actually speak for the full 12 minutes because I know, have a lot to say and I don't want to miss out on that. So, all right. So let me then turn to Lisa.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepa, and thanks to George Washington University, Christ University, Dr. Ayers, all of the other people who made this conference possible. And it's also a pleasure and an honor to be here with my co-panelists, Jeff Smith and Admiral Prakash. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S.-India relationship, but also the Quad, as you mentioned. So I think that we can see the significance of close U.S.-India security and defense cooperation, that closeness in order to maintain the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific was certainly demonstrated last week when China conducted its provocative live-fire drills and large-scale military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. These exercises certainly marked a turning point in the U.S.-China relationship and tensions over Taiwan, and really has shown the importance of the U.S.-India relationship and getting that right, solidifying that relationship, and frankly, moving more rapidly in strengthening those defense and security ties. And so the U.S., in addition to, we're going to see it building up its military resources, its military posture in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region. It will also be focusing on enlisting partners like India to help it counter China's rising aggression. And I think, as Jeff has spelled out, Washington and New Delhi have made good progress in improving their defense and security relationship over the last decade. But, China's provocative behavior, not only vis-a-vis Taiwan, but also on the India-China border, its gray zone activities, aggressive maritime activities throughout the Indo-Pacific, means that the U.S. and India must move more rapidly to solidify this collaboration. Jeff mentioned the importance of the signing of the foundational defense agreements, the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, LAMOA, the COMCASA, which is the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, of course, BECA, the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement. All these will help the U.S. and India share high-end technology, increase their logistics cooperation, sharing of sensitive information. All this is very important and has gone a long way toward deepening the bilateral security relationship. And Jeff mentioned the announcement in July where DTTI is going to move forward on co-developing air-launched unmanned aerial vehicles. And I think this is a demonstration that the U.S. is committed to co-developing critical defense platforms with India and will remain so. It's also notable that the trials for the FA-18 Super Hornet have been going very well. This, of course, is a major contender to fulfill India's requirement for multi-role carrier-based fighters. And this purchase will be critical for India's ability to project power in the Indian Ocean region. Perhaps, though, the most significant development in U.S.-India defense cooperation is the plan for the two armies to exercise together in October in the Indian state of Uttarakhand in the Himalayas. It's a joint high-altitude cold climate training exercise. And it's significant because it's being conducted about 62 miles from the line of actual control dividing India and China. And of course, China-India tensions along their disputed border remain high, despite the de-escalation that has taken place at some points along that border. And I think another alarming development that we need to discuss is the Chinese vessel that docked at Hambantota port in Sri Lanka on Tuesday. China is certainly flexing its muscles with Colombo during Colombo's time of economic and political crisis. And I think it's a warning to India from China that it can operate in its backyard. China, of course, says it's a survey ship conducting research in the Indian Ocean, but the fact is it has advanced technology, satellite capabilities, and it can certainly be used for other strategic purposes. I think in her opening remarks, Dr. Ayers mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. Nowhere have we seen the deleterious effects of the BRI than in Sri Lanka. And this, is really showing now with the economic crisis. Of course, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka is due to years of economic mismanagement, corruption, but also the fact that so many questionable investments in loans were made by China for these white elephant projects, most of which were in the Rajapaksa's hometown in Hambantota, demonstrates that the BRI can really cause problems for these smaller economies and can allow China to gain a strategic foothold. So this brings me to the Quad and its importance in checking Chinese influence. Certainly, the Quad has become really the linchpin of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and the U.S. Goal of maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific and to counter China's aggression and hegemony. The Quad Summit in Tokyo in May was, of course, the second in-person summit and the fourth total summit in the past year and a half. It was striking that the new Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, literally jumped on a plane the minute he was sworn in as the new Prime Minister of Australia to take part in the Quad, showing Australia's commitment to that grouping. And it's notable that Russia and China both showed their opposition to the Quad meeting by flying warplanes in joint patrols near Japanese airspace. The Quad leaders issued a joint statement, a lengthy joint statement about everything they're cooperating on. And I think the most significant announcement was this new Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, where they're going to enhance the collective maritime domain awareness throughout the region, connecting Southeast Asia to the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Islands, so that these countries can better protect their own territorial waters and protect their own sovereignty. So this really is a remarkable development. It's not security cooperation per se, but it certainly is edging up to security cooperation, which of course the Quad leaders have tried to explicitly say they're not a defense security grouping, but rather focused on economic issues, technology issues. But I think certainly, the Quad countries are building these habits of cooperation, and they could easily transition to more military cooperation if the need arises. Of course, Japan and Australia are already treaty allies of the United States and have very deep defense cooperation. As I mentioned, the US and India have strengthened their foundational defense cooperation through several agreements. So there is a very strong basis for military cooperation among the four countries. And CNAS recently published a paper. It's called Operationalizing the Quad. And we lay out several potential areas for security cooperation. We also assess where the Quad is on all of the other, 6 designated working groups, cyber, emerging technology, space, vaccines, and other areas. But we also push the envelope a bit and we say, if the 4 countries decide they want to increase their security cooperation, where could they do this? And so we recommend that the 4 nations quietly begin diplomatic discussions on regional contingencies and crisis management. We just had the crisis last week. It's an ongoing crisis with Taiwan. So I think it's really time that these kinds of discussions happen among the 4 countries. That they hold joint Quad naval patrols, expand reciprocal access agreements, consult on military applications of the critical and emerging technologies that they're already discussing. We further recommend that India be invited to attend the trilateral defense ministerial dialogue between the US, Japan, and Australia as an observer. And, we're talking about the regional architecture. I've just explained why I think the Quad is so important to that. But AUKUS is another part of that architecture that is developing. The AUKUS does show the US military commitment to the region. It shows Australia's readiness to step up in this area. It's, a long-term agreement. It's going to be at least 10 years before Australia, sees delivery of these nuclear-powered submarines, but it's more than just the nuclear-powered submarines. It is expanding Australia's military capabilities in cooperation with the U.S. on a whole host of new and advanced technologies. And so I think that the AUKUS and the Quad are complementary. There should be close consultations with Japan and India, within the Quad framework about the AUKUS and what's happening. And, ASEAN also is, I think, becoming more accepting of the Quad. There was a lot of skepticism about the Quad, whether the Quad was going to displace ASEAN as the main regional architecture. But I think there's a greater understanding from the ASEAN countries that the Quad is here to stay and has an important role to play. Let me just conclude by saying a few words about US and India's differences over Russia's war in Ukraine. I don't think we should just paper over these, but we should be able to discuss this freely and openly. So just a few weeks ago, the US House of Representatives passed an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to waive sanctions against India over its purchase of the Russian S-400. The legislation must now go to the Senate, but it's expected to pass. And then, of course, the legislation will be signed by the president, and it provides authority for the president to waive sanctions against India for that purchase. And I think it's good that this irritant is being removed from the US-India bilateral relationship. But I do still believe it's in India's long-term interest to reduce its military dependence on Russia. There are signs India is moving in this direction, gradually diversifying its military imports. But I would argue that it needs to pivot more rapidly to other defense suppliers. As Russia becomes increasingly isolated and sanctions take their toll on the Russian economy, Moscow will simply be a less reliable defense partner for India. It will have to focus on replenishing its own military stocks. We're already seeing signs that concern is there. And they'll lose access to critical technologies due to Western sanctions. Certainly, India is vulnerable to Chinese aggression along their disputed border. But I think it would behoove India to show strength and that it has strategic options to effectively manage those border tensions. And rather than trying to straddle between the U.S. and Russia, I think India should view its strategic partnership with the United States and the burgeoning Quad partnership as increasing those strategic choices. So let me just stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and to Admiral Prakash's comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. You've laid out a very ambitious agenda going forward, and I'm really very much eager to hear from Admiral Prakash at this point, his reactions and his own perspectives on this topic. And of course, there is no Indo-Pacific without Indo. So I can't think of anybody better than the Admiral to weigh in on his views. Over to you.
Thank you for having asked me here. I'm certainly not looking forward to what follows now, because two experts have spoken extensively, and I am a relative outsider to this event. But let me start by reminding Jeff Smith that start point of the Indo-US relationship is not 2005 or 2008. It's as far back as 1992, when we started the first Malabar exercise. Very soon after the end of the Cold War, the US reached out to India, and the Indian Navy was the first service to jump at it. And so we've been exercising and collaborating with each other, at least the two navies, for the past 30 years. So I think that should be the yardstick to measure our successes and failures, that we've been at it for 30 years and where have we reached today. There have been difficulties. It may have seemed it's probably a little bit like ducks paddling desperately under the water and on a smooth surface. There have been many difficulties on the way, but to the credit of both the navies, the leadership of both the navies, we managed to maintain a pretty steady relationship with each other, on which I think the diplomats and politicians have built upon. So that's the part which we need to be grateful about. There is good military to military cooperation. There's no doubt about it. And this recent development where our attaché can walk into the Pentagon, that's a very welcome step. But there are tremendous difficulties in the political domain, which the military often tries to overcome, but not always successfully. So the moot point is that in these 30 years, we have achieved quite a lot as far as exercises are concerned, as far as arms sales are concerned, but there is much more that we could have done. And I think I'll tackle this point at the outset. Jeff Smith mentioned the Arms Export Act, which needs to be amended. Yes, certainly that will be a most welcome step. There was mention of DTTI by both speakers. Now, DTTI is 10 years old, and DTTI is not the only agreement that we've come upon. I mean, this may sound a bit tedious, but if we go back to 2004, we started off with next steps in strategic partnership. Then there was Defense Framework Agreement in 2005, Indo-US Civil Nuclear Agreement 2008, DTTI 2012. Like that, there have been various steps which sound very grandiose, but have actually not resulted in very much progress, except in defense sales. And I'll explain why I'm being so blunt about it. And of course, for many years, we thought it was the foundational agreements which were holding up really close cooperation. But the last of the four foundational agreements was finally signed in 2020. Now, Ms. Curtis mentioned about India weaning itself off Russia. Now, many of us who worn uniform have also felt the same thing, that we perhaps erred in creating such a huge reliance on a single source, and it was not always to our best interest. It was because it was cheap, it was available, and the West had certainly rebuffed us not once but many times. So we had no choice. We went Russia, Soviet Union, and then Russia. But today the situation is that 65, 70, 75% of our weaponry, ammunition, missiles come from Russia. So if we decide to wean ourselves off, we will be literally disarming ourselves. And there is no alternative available to us today that we can suddenly say, all right, Russia, bye-bye, we're switching over to the USA. These things don't happen. They take time. And I must point out that in this aspect, we've been both equally guilty, because perhaps India more than the US, we didn't ask technology. We went in for exercises, and in the last 5 or 6 years, we purchased hardware by paying for it, dollars. So hardware is not the same as technology. So when somebody says that US is transferring a lot of technology to India, that is not true. Buying arms for dollars is just buying arms and more dependency, because you need spare parts. Now we jump out of the fire into the out of the frying pan into the fire. For now we'll be dependent on the USA. So what we should have done and what America should have helped us do was to create our own uh, establishment for weapon technology, for arms industry, etc. We didn't ask for it. America was so in the TTTI, it's trade and technology. Trade has overtaken technology. We've received very little technology, and this business of developing airborne UAVs, etc. I mean, those are peripheral things. Just as a matter of interest, India is in the process of, or has already imported 800,000 carbines and assault rifles. We don't make a jet engine, we don't make a decent tank engine, etc. Those are the things that we should have done, so that today, when Ms. Curtis says pull away from Russia, we could have said, all right, give us 5 years, we'll do so. So I think that should be clearly understood, and both of them represent think tanks which are influential. So perhaps this thought can be conveyed, that it's easy to say, pull out and pull yourselves out, but not easy to do, not at this juncture. As far as Quad is concerned, there's a lot of ambiguity. Of course, I'm an outsider now. I don't understand. I mean, I'm not into the inner decision making, but there is a lot of ambiguity. There was a Quad meeting in which the joint statement spoke of global health, climate change, emerging technology, infrastructure, cyber, education, clean energy, etc., etc. The word China does not find mention even once in that statement. Now, so if Ms. Curtis says that Quad has the potential to counter Chinese hegemony, I don't understand how. Unless and we keep repeating the same nostrum that it is not an Asian NATO. Well, unless it has some security connotation, I don't see how China is going to feel daunted. China is already scoffs at it at every opportunity, ridicules the Quad, sea foam and stuff like that. So I think either we say Quad is one organization which will do all this supply chain management, etc., and then create another Concord. Maybe the Malabar exercise can be converted into a Concord of countries which have convergence, but it has to have some security implication. Otherwise, India is the only country of the Quad which has no defense or security agreement with the USA. We are also the only country which has a live volatile border. And if the border flares up, nobody's going to come to our assistance, and we are aware of that. Just as a matter of interest, the area under current occupation by China is the same size as the island of Taiwan, 37,000 square kilometers. And the area that China is taking a claim to, Arunachal Pradesh, 90,000 square kilometers, is 3 times the size of Taiwan. And tomorrow, if China decides to emulate Russia in the Ukraine and walks into Arunachal Pradesh, they would have grabbed a huge amount of territory. So we are uh, in a truly in a bind. The Indian Army, the Air Force can hold off Chinese aggression on land perhaps for some time. But if it comes to a total war, then we are really going to need, some kind of outside assistance. So I think these kind of issues need to be kept in mind. So is Quad something we can rely on? And then suddenly we heard about AUKUS. I personally, when I was in service, we've asked our US counterparts, both politicians, SecNav, SecDef, CNO, look, Russia, the Soviet Union has trusted us with nuclear submarines. They gave us 2 submarines on lease. They sold us an aircraft carrier. They've helped us to develop a nuclear reactor for nuclear propulsion. Are you going to show us something equally? No, we've always been told that, look, US Congress will never allow nuclear technology, weapons, of course, nuclear propulsion technology. And here we find in 2021 that now Australia is being offered nuclear propulsion technology and much more. So there are doubts on both sides, and ambiguities which we need to resolve. And I'm not blaming anybody for it. Perhaps we've lacked clarity in what we need. We've lacked vision. We still don't have a national security strategy. Perhaps if we sat down and wrote one, maybe all these things would emerge clearly, and then we could frame our requirements. Ms. Solapalli, tell me if I'm overstepping my time.
You
Shall I
can take
stop?
another couple of minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, okay,
If
couple
you
of
can,
minutes.
yeah.
All right. So now there was mention of regional security organization. It's the fact that the Indian Ocean has always lacked, such organization because of internal disagreements and so on. And Indo-Pak rivalry is certainly one of the factors, and now, of course, Sino-Indian rivalry and so on. And yet we have, once again, I think this mantle has been placed on India's shoulder by the USA, when suddenly we found that we were told that you are the net security provider for this part of the world. Now that's a fairly heavy responsibility for the Indian Navy to shoulder, or the Indian Defense Organization to shoulder. So there again, we will need, if India is to indeed be the net security provider for the Indian Ocean or Indo-Pacific, we are going to need assistance, help, support, etc. And it's become very painfully obvious with the entry of this space research ship into neighboring Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. I mean, Sri Lanka, of course, is on its knees, and it is beholden to China as much it is beholden to India for sisters. But India alone cannot pull Sri Lanka out of the hole that they've dug for themselves. So Sri Lanka will need assistance from other countries. So for India now to lean on Sri Lanka and say that, look, do this, do that, is not going to work out. The last point I want to make is that um, in all this talk of, I mean, my talk about security, etc., then an important point which is normally missed out is the economic aspect. The Quad doesn't adequately address the economic aspects of the BR, what the BRI is planning to, the Belt and Road Initiative is doing or has it in store for the region. And is there any counter to that? I mean, countries are falling one after the other into the debt trap. They lack infrastructure at the same time. They need it. And so China is just lapping up. And so we need to get on the road some really viable proposition which will pick up countries like Sri Lanka and offer them a safety net. Today it's Sri Lanka, tomorrow it could be anybody. I don't want to name, but any of our smaller neighbors could fall into the same debt trap. So we need to create a safety net and offer it promptly rather than just talking about it, so that we save nations from falling into the into this kind of trap. So I think with those, I have tried to cover most of the points that were made by the two speakers. If there's something left out, we can handle it later. Thank you. I've finished.
Thank you very much for covering so many topics, Admiral Prakash. I just want to remind the audience that they should feel free to put the questions that they have into the chat box. Now it's time to do it. Before I open it up for the Q&A, I know that you have raised several questions, Admiral, for both Lisa and especially Lisa, and perhaps she may want to respond to a few of those points. But I do want to ask about when you look at the overarching Indo-Pacific regional security architecture, because that is one of the things that we want to do a little bit of thinking about here. And this is something that Alyssa raised as well, the areas of priorities. If you had to choose some area of priority in the security sector that you think can actually build out into a larger framework that resembles an institution. I mean, we don't have to get into, what makes an institution, but what would be, I'd like to hear from each of you, your thoughts on where you would find the most promising for India and the US to take a lead on. And Lisa, you talked a bit about, regional crisis management, for example. I mean, I can think of Sri Lanka as one issue, but let me just do that. And let me start with, we'll go back in the order that we started, if you don't. So, Jeff, what's on your top?
So you're essentially looking at what issues might be most ripe for India and the US to promote cooperation that could in turn lead to more of a regional buy-in or infrastructure? I think it's a very good question. The first few things that come to mind, well, first would actually be humanitarian aid and disaster relief, because first of all, I think India and the U.S. are uniquely capable of providing HADR assistance in the region. I think there's very little political resistance to the countries doing this. There's very little resistance among other regional parties. It's not a controversial topic. ASEAN is not going to be opposed to US, India, and others providing humanitarian aid and disaster relief. We already have a basis for multilateral cooperation in this regard. I mean, the regional core group formed after the December tsunami in 2004 was the original basis for what eventually became the Quad. And so you actually you have a need, you have the capability, you have the will, and you have few sort of political or geopolitical obstacles to building out a framework for providing humanitarian aid and disaster relief. And we already do this to a degree, but more formalizing the process and institutionalizing it, I think, is an opportunity that we could realize fairly easily and quickly. I think maritime domain awareness is another area that has gotten more attention in recent years, and there is more happening bilaterally and trilaterally on MDA. There's a new Maritime Domain Awareness Fusion Center that has opened in India. There's a lot of interest, including from Australia and Japan, on MDA cooperation. There's a lot already happening on that front. But there's another area where there's a need, there's will, and there's little resistance to enhancing MDA cooperation. So if India and the US or the Quad countries could serve as the catalyst for building out a larger regional architecture, I think that would be highly productive. Maybe the last but more difficult issue area would be infrastructure. Toward the end of the Trump administration, they tried to get this initiative off the ground called the Blue Dot Network. And it would essentially provide a set of standards for what infrastructure projects in the region should look like. A set of sort of minimum standards of transparency, accountability, financial sustainability that would help countries like Sri Lanka and others maybe avoid some of these debt traps and some of the more nefarious, non-economic elements of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. It's been difficult to get multilateral cooperation on infrastructure off of the ground, but I think even agreeing to a basic set of principles and standards, and then providing some kind of certification that if you want to come in and build a port project in Colombo, it's got to meet these standards to get a blue dot or a blue check certification. Maybe that would sort of provide at least a baseline for countries to evaluate the long-term financial and non-financial costs of some of these infrastructure projects. And that's something that the US and India, and frankly, all the Quad countries have an interest in. And that's something I think the developing countries should have an interest in as well. So those would be three that I would throw out onto the table for further discussion.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jeff. Lisa, do you want to elaborate on some of the things that you had raised?
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to respond to some of Admiral Prakash's very good remarks. And, he asked the question, what are we to think of the Quad? It's ambiguous. I think maybe intentionally ambiguous. Yes, the Quad joint statements don't mention China, but certainly we know that China is on the mind of each of these countries. And when the joint statement says, it calls for a rules-based order that respects the UN Charter and maintains territorial sovereignty of all countries, we know the implication is that China is and Russia for that matter, is violating this idea of territorial sovereignty of all countries. So I think that's important, that, you know, the Quad is a group of 4 powerful democracies who are seeking to try to shape the order of the Indo-Pacific. And they're doing this by working on important areas, important issues to the region: vaccine distribution, technologies, climate, space, infrastructure. And I think that the collective work on these issues is part of a broader effort to manage a rising China and ensure that democratic powers, rather than China or other authoritarian countries, are meeting the challenges in the region and shaping the future architecture and order of the region. With regard to the issue of economics, Admiral Prakash rightly said that the economic piece seems to be the weak area of the Quad, and I would agree with that. I think that we probably have to lower our expectations. I don't think you're going to see a Quad FTA, mainly because of India and US more protectionist economic policies that we're seeing because of their own domestic issues. But I would say that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was introduced in May is important. India, of course, has agreed to be part of the IPEF, which is a very good development. There's, I think, 14 total countries who are part of the IPEF. The IPEF will deal with issues like trade, including digital trade, supply chains, environment, taxes, corruption issues, et cetera. So it's not going to be your traditional trade agreement where countries are getting market access and negotiating tariff reductions. But it can be a way to catalyze more cooperation. And I would really emphasize the supply chain issue, because I think this is an issue where India really stands to benefit as countries are trying to reshore away from China, trying to have more resilient supply chains. India could really be a beneficiary of that effort. So I would emphasize the supply chain issue when it comes to Quad, rather than thinking about getting trade access to one another's economies. And just to wrap up my comments, Jeff talked about some issues that we should see the Quad focus more attention on. I do think Sri Lanka is an issue that the Quad could contribute positively toward. Japan is a major creditor to Sri Lanka. Australia has great interest in the country. And so there could be coordination among the 4 countries to kind of help Sri Lanka get back on its feet, become politically, economically stable. But one of the major issues is, China is one of its largest creditors, but it's not clear whether China is going to cooperate with the IMF and other creditors in restructuring Sri Lanka's debt. And so that's the major problem. Even though China has contributed to this situation where we are in Sri Lanka, it's not clear how they're going to work with other organizations and countries to resolve it. And just lastly, on infrastructure, this is an area where the 4 countries, the Quad countries, can make a difference in terms of their coordination, mapping out the infrastructure needs in the region, complementing each other's efforts, setting the standards, like Jeff had mentioned, for transparent, open, sustainable infrastructure projects. But what has been less workable has been the commingling of financing. And we saw that with Japan, US, Australia, they're trying to work out joint projects, and it's been a bit more difficult. So I think we should probably stay away from trying to have any kind of joint fund, and stay away from commingling countries' financing. but they can certainly coordinate in providing alternatives for countries so they're not just reliant on Chinese investment and loads for their infrastructure needs.
Thank you, Lisa. Admiral, I do want to hear what your main priorities you think would be the most promising in terms of building out a more regional infrastructure with regional institution, I should say.
Yeah. Yes, I think Jeff was essentially right when he picked on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, because this is something we've already done and we keep doing it over and over again. It's a good foundation to build a Concord kind of thing upon. And there are many organizations which are already, not to build a new organization will take time. So we need to base it on either the Quad or the Milan exercise which the Indian Navy hosts every alternate year, or ION, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. You could pick any of these which are already in existence. They've been in existence for many years, and then organize them into a working organization with a headquarters and a secretariat and a charter and agenda. The agenda can be as innocuous as you want it to be, but it will get navies and governments working together so that when the need arises, you can step into the security domain very easily. So HADR is one, maritime domain awareness, pandemics. I mean, you could even create a small medical task to have a hospital ship as the core medical task force, which can go cruising around. China does it all the time. They've got 2 hospital ships. So I think it's a ripe area to exploit. Just one small point about Quad being adequate in its current state. Now, the point is this, that China has had its way for the last decade and a half, and they've seen Obama's pivot to the east. They've seen Trump's free and open Indo-Pacific. They've seen a couple of Indo-Pacific strategies. They've seen the U.S. Navy's persistent freedom of navigation voyages into territorial waters, but they've just ignored everything and done what they wanted. They've recovered 3 to 4,000 acres of, they've created 3 to 4,000 acres of land out of nothing, out of rocks and shoals. And they've, um, they've, they've armed those little islands that they've created, Fiery Cross, Subi Reef, Mischief Reef. They've got missile batteries, they've got runways, they've got harbors. So what I'm saying is that China has gone ahead and done what it wanted to do. They've disregarded the court of arbitration. They've disdained it. So they've done exactly what they wanted to do. So neither the Quad, nor the Pivot, nor the FOIP have helped. So we need to do something more than that. And by we I mean India, because we are sitting on a gunpowder keg which could blow up anytime. That's all. Thank you.
Admiral, I do want to ask you one follow-up from Lisa, which is the idea of a regional crisis management group. Does that do you think that that would be could be the kernel of some kind of a bigger framework institutionally?
Yes, indeed.
Is that too sensitive?
Sounds like a good idea. Like it was pointed out, India already has a fusion center into which all the maritime domain awareness information is fed into. We have a big picture of what's going on all over the Indian Ocean and now possibly into the Pacific also. And perhaps if we were to create this thing in our Andaman Islands in Port Blair, which is located in the center of the Bay of Bengal, a crisis management group with a small token force at its disposal, both ships and aircraft, to respond to be the first responders to any crisis would be a good idea. Of course, the decisions will all have to be taken at the political level, and the navies and coast guards can be the executors of the political will.
Your own thoughts on joint naval patrol?
They're already being done. We have India at least has joint naval patrols with Sri Lanka, with Thailand, with Indonesia, with I think with Malaysia. So we have joint naval patrols. Perhaps we should have had joint naval patrols with Pakistan too, but we haven't got there yet. But joint naval patrols are very good for creating mutual understanding, for avoiding crisis situations, especially fishery disputes and so on. Thousands of Indian fishermen are arrested both by Sri Lanka and by Pakistan. So joint naval patrols are a good idea, but even a better idea is joint Coast Guard patrols. They're less threatening to people.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, I'm happy to now open it up for questions. We have several that have come in. Let me start with a question for Lisa. The question is, what are the chances of the U.S. forming a similar alliance, defense alliance on the lines of AUKUS, but this time between India, France, and the U.S. To build nuclear-powered submarines? Because it would meet one of the objectives of weaning India away from Russia. Probably this should also be commented on by Admiral Prakash.
Great, thank you. I think it's a good question. And I would just say, as India reduces its dependence on Russian military gear, and that relationship is, starts to reduce, I think that something like this becomes more possible. I think, we have to see this as a two-way street, and it's sort of the chicken and the egg prospect. Admiral Prakash spelled out that right now, India doesn't have alternatives to the Russian equipment that it's been relying on. He makes a fair point that the US and India for many, many years did not have this relationship, that the US was not sharing sophisticated technology, and so India really had no choice. So it is going to take time for this shift to start to happen. But I would point to this no limits partnership that we saw Russia and China make on February 4th, and how alarming that should be for the world to see these two authoritarian nations coming together, backing each other in their hegemonic pursuits, should be a concern to India as well, given its issues with China and particularly on the border. So I think that we just have to continue to move in this direction where the US and India can build confidence in each other and can start to see each other as important strategic partners. They'll never form an alliance, we know that, but the US should be the partner of choice for India when it comes to sophisticated military technology. I believe US technology is the best, and for the foreseeable future. And so it would be in India's interest, I think, to begin to make that shift, and to deepen that relationship with the United States. And I think we will see that moving forward. I just would hope to see it happen even more rapidly than it is.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, another question here is perhaps for Jeff and Lisa. The question here is to do with the building off of Admiral Prakash's points earlier, according to this questionnaire. The recent, how reliable can the United States be in terms of India's military direct needs? Suppose there's a development like what happened in Ukraine with China in India, with the US pulling back the way it did from Afghanistan and various other places, how can the Indian policymakers be confident, basically? I mean, also with the America First policy and so on, is there also a question here about, do you have to adopt a certain type of economic framework in order to actually also be able to have aid come to
I
you?
can take that, and maybe if you and Lisa will permit, I can also
Yeah, go ahead.
just make a point on the Quad from the discussion. Would the U.S. come to India's aid if China were to attack? Obviously, we don't know the direct circumstances surrounding that, who's in office in the United States, what's the Congress's disposition. I mean, I can't predict with 100% certainty what would happen without knowing the details of the contingency. But we can look at history, and we do know that in 1962, when China attacked India, the United States came in and helped. It provided India with the aid that was requested. And that was at a time when India and the United States were not strong strategic partners. We did not have four foundational military agreements. We did not have arms sales and civil nuclear cooperation and intelligence sharing. We were much more estranged at the time. And yet the United States still provided the assistance that was requested. More recently, we have the experience of the Gowon Crisis, where India did make emergency requests for drones, cold weather gear from the United States, as the Chinese were involved in a border crisis, border incursion, and the United States provided that assistance. And the United States came out and condemned China's actions. So we do have cases of when there has been Chinese aggression and India has requested help from the United States, it has been offered. And there were, frankly, periods where the Indian government was asking the US not to speak more loudly on this topic, not to take more public profile on this. And so I think it is likely that the U.S. would provide assistance. Exactly what form would that take? I mean, all this depends on the precise contingency. But given the strength of the relationship and the recent history of cooperation, yes, I do think that that the U.S. would be helpful. This not mentioning China, I just want to respond to 2 points by Admiral Prakash. You know, I think he's sort of criticized the Quad for not mentioning China, not directly mentioning China more, being more overt in criticizing Chinese behavior. If that's true, and if that's the case, India is the reason that we're not more directly mentioning China. It is often the Indian government that doesn't want to take too forward a position in publicly criticizing China. Whether it's over activities in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere, it's often the US, Japan, and Australia that are more vocal and forthright about criticizing China in public forums, and the Indian government that prefers not to do that. And so I agree it would be helpful if the Quad was a little more public sometimes in criticizing China, but that's a conversation that needs to happen inside New Delhi. I also am not entirely convinced by this idea that, well, the Quad hasn't worked because China is simply doing what it wants, including with the artificial islands in the South China Sea and elsewhere. That is true, and these developments are concerning. But you know, we don't really know what China would be doing without the Quad if the U.S. wasn't around. I mean, it could look a lot worse. And we also, I'm not sure that there was a Quad answer for what China did with the artificial islands in the South China Sea. I mean, did you want to go to war with China over that? I don't know that we were prepared to do that in the US. I don't know that India was prepared to do that. I mean, the reality is it was a complex situation, and we don't have a lot of good options for stopping them once they got started. And so it would have been great, you know, if we could have done more, but there are some situations where China is going to gain sort of a first mover advantage, and it's not going to be possible for the Quad to you know, prevent them from doing provocative things, including around the Taiwan Straits. But that doesn't mean the Quad is a failure, and that doesn't mean that there's nothing the Quad can do that is helpful or productive or that acts as a deterrent to even more belligerent Chinese behavior. But one point I do certainly agree with Admiral Prakash on is that the Quad should not lose focus of the security component. And I do worry that since President Biden took office, we certainly at Heritage were relieved to see that he didn't abandon the Quad. In fact, in some ways, he did the opposite, and he elevated it to the leader level and expanded the scope. And that was a very productive development. But he also, working with others, shifted the agenda toward a more soft power focus on global commons, on cyber and education and AI. And I think these are productive things for the four countries to be working on. But we shouldn't lose sight of what compelled them to start the quadrilateral security dialogue in the first place. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these are four countries that are uniquely willing and capable of resisting Chinese aggression and coercion. And the security aspect is the unique thing that those four countries can bring to the table. And so I know security remains an informal focus of the Quad, but I think it needs to be moved back to front and center in addition to these other soft power initiatives that I think, have their own place on the Quad's agenda. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Lot of questions here on China and U.S.-India relations. Let me just take a couple of them. One of them is the, Lisa, you mentioned the Chinese vessel in Hambantota and the fact that India-U.S., nobody was able to stop that, partly according to the Sri Lankans. There was no good enough reason given for why they shouldn't. So that's one. Is there any way that the Indians and the Americans could actually counter this, a show of influence by China? What would your recommendations be? And secondly, this is more for Admiral Prakash, and that has to do with the fact that India often doesn't say much vocally about China, whether it's Tibet or most recently in the Taiwan Straits crisis.
Can I talk in English or Hindi?
So your comments on that,
What?
Admiral, and then so Lisa, and then Admiral.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepa. I just want to quickly reiterate something that Jeff talked about, because I think it's really important. You asked the question, could India rely on the U.S. if India and China came to blows or were involved in conflict? Well, we had a major test of that, right? In 2020, the Gowon Valley crisis. I was senior director at the NSC when this happened, and I saw firsthand how the U.S. pulled out all stops to support India. Jeff already spelled out what that looked like. I would add to the list the enhancing of intelligence and information sharing. There was a lot of coordination behind the scenes. The U.S. was ready to meet any and all Indian requests. And so I think the U.S. passed a major test. If Indians question whether the U.S. would come out in support of India in the event it became involved in a major crisis with China, the U.S. has already passed the test. We showed that we would, and we did. So I feel like that, should not even be questioned anymore. The U.S. showed that it's a reliable partner. And, I feel strongly about this. And I know there was a narrative developing in India a couple months ago. It was expressed when I was at the Raisina dialogue that somehow the U.S. did not help India in its time of crisis. And that's absolutely not true. I will just say that. And as Jeff pointed out, the United States deferred to India in terms of the public positioning and the public messaging. The U.S. did not want to get out ahead of India on the messaging, and so really deferred to India and what it found most helpful in terms of the U.S. public messaging during the crisis. And on the question about the Chinese vessel in the Hambantota port, I think Sri Lanka felt very torn. They had wanted the Chinese not to make the stop at the last minute. The Chinese became very angry. So I think, the Sri Lankans have showed their weakness under pressure from China. And I think it behooves India and the U.S. to try to work together to shore up Sri Lanka, to see what we can do to reorient their foreign policy and national security more toward the Quad nations and India. And I think there is an opportunity because, as I said, when the protesters came out in May, they pointed to these white elephant projects in Hambantota. as part of the problem, and that the Rajapaksas and their close ties with China were part of the problem. So I think there is an opportunity to try to shift Sri Lanka back toward India, the United States, and other countries, and so that they have options and alternatives, and that China cannot further dig its influence into Sri Lanka. Yes, the vessel did go there, but now it's time to make sure that it promptly leaves on time, and perhaps there are ways for India and the U.S. to show that they are an influence in that area, and that they are going to meet any provocative or assertive or aggressive Chinese moves in the region.
Admiral, would you weigh in, and also about whether India is doing enough on not vocally saying anything about the Taiwan Straits and
Thank you.
Tibet?
First of all, this it's very, very nice to hear that America reacted, the USA reacted very positively to our the emergency in Galwan in 2020. It's not widely known. And one of the reasons is that possibly India said to keep it low key. And that's one point that I need to make, that of the four Quad members, it's only the USA which speaks out against China. The other three are very hesitant. There is a lot of trepidation about annoying China. That's why none of the three have openly said things. And of course, I accept that possibly India is the one which is soft pedaling it the most. The question about America's reliability as a friend or partner is not a neurosis. Those of us who dealt with the US state and the defense departments are aware that there have been deep differences between the two departments in the USA. Or within the department, there have been dichotomies where one section of people wanted to help and the other said back off, and we've seen such things. So it is not a figment of imagination, it's happened. The other thing is about sanctions. CATSA has just been waived after hanging over our head for the last many years. So this is, I think we need to, as friends and partners, we need to work on this. Perhaps we need to hear more mention of Siachen, of Eastern Ladakh and Arunachal in official communiques, as we hear of Taiwan and so on. It's an issue of concern for us as much as Taiwan is an issue of concern for the USA. So all these will be steps to reassure each other of the steadfastness of their commitment and friendship. Coming to the so-called spy ship in Hambantota, I'm afraid my views are a little unorthodox. Unless India wants to exercise a Monroe Doctrine and a sphere of influence and say that nobody in our region should do anything without asking us, which we are not capable of enforcing. Such ship visits will happen more and more often. It is not a warship. It doesn't threaten our security. It's a research ship which monitors missile launches and satellites. We have one too. Possibly one of these days it will sail into East China Sea to monitor an Indian ICBM launch or a satellite launch. So that if China starts objecting to our ship entering Vietnam or Indonesia or Malaysia, how will we react? So I think we need to, and little Sri Lanka, they're in a tight spot. They're on their knees. This is hardly the time to pressurize them and say, don't do this or don't do this. I think this was a maladroit step. It could have been well ignored. A ship in harbor is quite harmless. You can send your people to have a good hard look at it, what it's all about. It is when the ship is at sea that you need to be wary of it. But there again, we can put our own spy ships and planes to track it. So I think there was a bit of an overreaction there. And if we still do want to avoid such situation, then quiet diplomacy is the answer, not public admonishments to say do this or don't do this. Not good diplomacy. Thank you.
All right. We are a few minutes over time, but with your permission, if I could take a few more minutes from you three, I would be remiss because I did not ask a couple of questions that frame the conference, and if you don't mind. Quickly, You know, there is this view that when you think about institution building in the Indo-Pacific, that the United States has preferred a more formal type of architecture, such as it has in the transatlantic relationship, whereas the Asians, especially India as well, prefer a more flexible, informal kind of setup. And I wonder whether or not the last 2 decades of working together, India and the US, in the Quad especially, have they been socialized to each other's preferences or not? Do you think that they've come closer on, India's maybe preference for informal, US's for formal? That's one quick question. The other is just quickly on the three frameworks I mentioned. What's your favorite? What do you go to? Realism, liberalism, norms? What do you think are the most important in this when you look at US India? I'm really sorry for keeping you a bit more. Jeff, you want to go first?
Sure. I'll give you a real quick answer to the second question, and that's realism,
Yeah. Okay.
period.
All right.
The first question, well, just very briefly on the first question, I think you were right to identify that the U.S. sort of has traditionally had this sort of legalistic culture when it comes to foreign affairs. And, for much of the 20th century, we had essentially two categories. Either you were a formal treaty ally and you were entitled to a variety of benefits, frankly, and separate legal status across a wide range of cooperative activities, or you were not a formal treaty ally. And there were some exceptions for this, even going back to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, but that was the way we mostly did business. And I think India actually is what jostled us out of this mindset in this framework. And the India US partnership has sort of forced us to create exceptions and carve out a new type of status, a new type of strategic partnership, a new type of relationship that isn't a formal treaty ally, but that does in some ways operate like an ally. And, I would argue we actually do more quantitatively and qualitatively with India than we do with some of our formal treaty allies, like Thailand, for instance. And so that has sort of shaken us out of our traditional MO, and we've had to do things like carve out exceptions at the international nuclear regulatory regime, grant India special STA1 status for defense exports, sign these foundational military agreements, and essentially craft a new framework for a 21st century strategic partnership that doesn't fit the mold of our 20th century partnerships. And I think that's a good thing. And it's also necessary. I mean, India was not prepared to do formal alliances, but the common interests and common interest in cooperation was there. And so we had to come up with something different. And, in some ways that has also applied to the multilateral arena. And we are lacking these more formal security institutions. We're being forced to do what we can, which is minilaterals, bilaterals, trilaterals, quads, and hoping that these overlapping networks create enough of an informal regime that our interests are secured. I mean, you could even argue the same thing is happening on the trade front. There's simply not the political will anymore to do large multilateral trading agreements. That's true both in India and the United States. And so we're forced to fall back on what we can do, which is bilateral FTAs. And even those are difficult in some regards. And so I think it's a reflection of the reality that the world doesn't operate anymore on this legalistic, large-scale institutional framework mechanism that was more prevalent in the 20th century. And so let's acknowledge that and move forward on what we can make progress on.
Lisa, any quick thoughts?
Yeah, I know I have a different viewpoint. I would say liberalism. I think the fact that the US and India are both democracies is very important, particularly, where we see that China does try to spread its authoritarian ideology. And I think it's important. Ideologies are important in the 21st century. And, the best chance that we have for countering Chinese aggression is by ensuring that countries can maintain their own sovereignty and maintain their own choices. So I think the US and India coming together around a strong ideology of this free and open Indo-Pacific, which of course was coined by Shinzo Abe, of course, tragic that he was assassinated on July 8th. He had a very clear vision for the region, but I think the best way to honor his memory is for us to carry forward that very strong vision, which is based on liberal ideas. So yeah, I would say that, if we talk about straight realism, this would make it easier for China to sort of find its way to have more influence on the global stage. I think China does play to India's goals for a multipolar world. China is happy that India continues to rely on Russia, continues to import Russian oil, because this undercuts, of course, what the US is trying to do. So I do think that allowing liberalism to drive the basis of the relationship will be the best way for us to overcome what is the seminal threat of the 21st century, which is China's rise.
Admiral, you have the last word.
Okay, well, I'd go for realism, and I wish that India would drop its ambiguities about it and follow true realism in all its policies. And importing oil from China at this juncture is, I think, a classic example of realism. At the same time, although we say that we've shed the hesitations of history, the ghost of non-alignment is still hovering around us. Because we remain wedded to the belief that any partnership or alliance would detract from New Delhi's influence, its prestige, its autonomy, and its status or its image as an emerging global power. And this is in spite of the fact that in 1971, we shed all our inhibitions and signed a 25-year Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which was meant to warn off both Beijing and Washington, and which it did. So we've sort of played both sides against the middle. I think we need to make up our minds and go for realism. But I don't think that's likely, because I've got a quote here from a very recent book by our Minister for Foreign Affairs, and I'll just read it briefly. He says, "This is the time for us to engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies of support." You can make whatever you wish out of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this has been extremely productive, very illuminating panel, and my panelists were so superb. We could just go on, and I thank you for your patience with me for keeping you over time. I do want to ask the audience to please stay and fill out the survey, because we do find very good results from this, and we will share that with all of you when we get the results. We'll also be producing a report from the event today. So with that, I look forward to seeing some of you. If you can make it tomorrow, that would be great. Otherwise, many thanks, and it's been my enormous pleasure to be here with you three today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The link,
Thank you.
yeah, the link remains the same for tomorrow as well. So you're most welcome to join tomorrow. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.